simply does not feature in their discussions of community and neighbourliness. And as a result of that, and as a result of the very narrow representation of women's lives that these post-war scholars evolved, they also, I think, miss interesting currents which were to emerge more conspicuously in the late 1960s in the form of workplace and student and feminist militancy and radicalism. There are clues there, if we look at very different sources, those produced by the so-called New Left in the late 1950s and 1960s, by people including the socialist historian E.P. Thompson, who very much did see that there was something about the kind of seething discontent of these older women telling their daughters to have very different kinds of lives that might not lead to the kind of aspirational, individualistic social mobility route that the post-war sociologists thought it would, but it might lead to something very different, and it did. By the 1960s, the daughters who had been born in the 1940s were growing up. Office work was their largest employer. And yet, although post-war sociologists tended to think of office workers as a very different, more aspirational class than the manual workers they had come from, we see, as these daughters come of age in the 1960s, a huge increase in white-collar trade unionism. There's a sense in this joining of trade unions, and later in the 1960s, in these young trade unionists' demands for equal pay, and then later in both their offices and in factories for a greater demand in collective bargaining, not only over wages and working conditions, but in the way that work itself is organised. We see in this a sense of entitlement, which I think the post-war state was indirectly responsible for. When we read the accounts of women who grew up in the 1940s, one of the things that they talk about is the great difference in the way that they saw their right to a place in the world compared to their mothers. The universal entitlement to education, to a health service, to social security benefits, and also the post-war political narrative of this being a brave new world and one in which freedom was constantly emphasised, was taken by these young women and used in ways that the state didn't necessarily predict. The 1950s discourse of freedom in the UK was very much posited against the idea of the totalitarian Eastern Bloc, but freedom and independence meant something very different to young women who had been brought up to contrast their own lives with those of domestic servants living in middle-class households in the 1930s. To them, freedom meant more control over work, greater social and financial independence. And this is what they sought to get for themselves in the 1960s and 1970s. They saw what they were doing, not always as rebelling, either against their parents, who had encouraged them to aspire to different kinds of lives, or against the state, which, as far as they were concerned, had brought them up to believe that they were entitled to a degree of equality. Now they were simply reaching out for what they wanted. As feminists, as trade union radicals, as militants, they pursued these aims, and in the 1960s and 1970s, they also pursued those aims as wives and mothers. Against the sociological distinction between white-collar workers and manual workers, we have to remember that a growing proportion of households in the UK by the 1970s were headed by a man in manual work and a woman who was an office worker or a nurse. Very often, in the industrial disputes of the 1960s and 1970s, men who were reliant on strike pay were only able to remain out on the picket line because their wives in public sector white-collar work were able to fund them being on the picket line. Personal testimonies suggest that rather than there being any kind of tension about that in households, very often women saw this as a political contribution towards a struggle that they saw as being partly their own. That idea of broadening what we mean by politics and militancy is also highlighted if we look at a group who I call welfare state professionals. The women born in the 1940s who were able to get jobs as teachers, nurses, social workers and so on as the welfare state expanded. There were two welfare state expansions in Britain, one in the 40s and then an even more major one in the 1960s when Labour came back to power after 13 years out of government. As a result of this, once again, room at the top expands, women are able to take up new roles without competing directly with men. Very often, the women who entered these new jobs saw their work as a political contribution. Often they were upwardly mobile. Their parents had worked in factories as servants or as clerks. They talk in personal testimonies about their work as social workers or teachers as giving back to the communities from which they came. They also saw themselves as helping to shape the post-war state. And I think that's incredibly important. In the UK now, we're so used to the welfare state, even though it's disappearing, that we think of it as a kind of given and a monolith to which we respond. But this generation knew the welfare state as very new. They saw themselves not simply as the beneficiaries of it, but as agents of change in helping to mould it and determine its future course, as teachers, as social workers, as nurses. It's often pointed out that before the 1980s, teachers and nurses in the UK were not particularly, quote-unquote, militant groups. Very often they chose not to strike where other workers might have struck because of concerns about the impact on their pupils, or particularly in the health service, the impact on vulnerable patients. That said, their trade unionism increased rapidly in the 1970s. Many of these women were, in their spare time, active in the feminist movement, which helped to ensure that in the 1970s we saw more equality legislation introduced into the UK than ever before. Pay differentials between men and women narrowed more rapidly than ever before. Trade unionism reached its highest ever level in the UK, in the professions, the public sector, as well as in industrial work. And socioeconomic equality reached its highest level ever in the UK. It's declined ever since. So, although they weren't necessarily on picket lines, these teachers, nurses, welfare state professionals were indeed making a very political contribution as agents of change to the workforce. I think that this narrative also reminds us that very often feminist scholars have, for very understandable reasons, seen the modern state as either benevolent towards women or as repressively patriarchal. What I've tried to suggest is that this is to some extent, in the UK case, a false opposition. Women did not see themselves as subject to a welfare state, but instead as helping to create it. So just to conclude, I've tried to suggest that women experience the labour market not just as workers in a particular trade or sector, although we certainly need very many more studies of particular trades and sectors in the UK as across Europe, but also as wives and mothers and as daughters. Also, and fundamentally, something that has been a kind of undercurrent in this paper rather than something I've brought out, women experience the labour market as actual and potential mothers. Their biological sex, the fact that they were seen and understood as reproducers of labour power, hugely impacted on how they were treated by the state and by employers at various times. I've tried to suggest that family strategies provided ways for women to negotiate and fulfil aspirations for themselves and for their daughters, especially when other collective means of seeking improvement politically or through labour strategies were not easy to initiate or to access for them. After both wars, transition involved disruptions to women's work. There was nothing inevitable about the course that women's work took in Britain. After the First World War, there was a great backlash against women being in the workforce, but particularly in those areas where they were seen to compete with men. After the Second World War, a political narrative which was about disillusioning people with socialism very much took women's work and their role in the home as emblems of what was right with Britain and wrong with the Eastern Bloc. That said, the situation after both World Wars was very distinct. After the First World War, there was a sense in which women were not shoved back to the home, but were forcibly removed from some sectors in order to be put into domestic service. After the Second World War, once again, women were not forced back into the home. Instead, and despite the political narrative that I've just outlined, there was in fact great state encouragement for women to enter the workforce in larger numbers, particularly to stand for the increasing state administration and also the welfare state professions. After the Second World War, full employment and the security it offered, together with the rise of public sector work, made it easier for women to become trade unionists and workplace militants. But there were also cultural and social reasons for this that we shouldn't ignore, including that sense of entitlement to a better future imparted by mothers and by the post-war welfare state that I've outlined here. What all this reminds us is that post-war transitions are incredibly important in disrupting teleological, straightforward narratives about political and economic progress, and in challenging our ideas about who effects change. They're also a reminder that the kind of political narratives which appear in times of instability may have repercussions that are not predicted by the architects of those narratives, and that we need to scrutinise how far narratives of stability, returns to normality, or new ways of doing things are ever completely received and imbibed by those that they are aimed at. We hear a lot in the scholarship about how the state after 1945 in Western societies became more oriented towards surveillance, society became more dependent on experts, whether politicians, bureaucrats or social scientists, and about how post-war affluence changed lives. These narratives are all very valuable, but I argue that they overlook how many ordinary women became active agents of change, influenced by their own or their mother's participation in the workforce and by their mother's hardship, by the memories that were imparted to them. These women believed that they had the right and the potential to shape the post-war future, and as workers, as militants and as feminists, they did just that.